Right. Janelle, are you ready? You ready for this?
I'm ready for you, Sean. Let's do it.
All right. First, I want to just thank all of you for joining us. Shout out to the folks who we've been traveling with along this journey, who are here today. I can see several of you. We'll have a slide with all of your headshots in a moment. So get ready for your opportunity for fame and celebrity. What I'd like to do is start this off in a way that I start off many things, which I think is important to be grounded in, is a dad joke. And so here we are this morning with a joke to offer. Why did the orange lose the race? Feel free to drop your answers in the chat. Going once, going twice. No answers in the chat. Clearly, he didn't have skin in the game. Well, that's clever. He didn't have appeal. Orange does have appeal. The answer is they peeled off at the wrong moment. Not a bad one. The orange ran out of juice. Ran out of juice. Juice. Yeah, okay, we'll just sit with that one for a minute. If you didn't get it now, you'll get it later, and it'll be just as bad then, I'm sure. Welcome to the Alternative First Responders group. We've worked together for several months to come up with framework and recommendations on what it would look like to have people showing up on site, on scene, that are reflective of the immediate needs that are pressing for those that are engaging 911 in an urgent situation. I'm Sean Good. I steward a nonprofit in the greater Seattle area called Choose 180, where we work to transform systems of injustice and support young people who have been harmed by them. And my co-chair is Gabe Rodriguez, who is the police chief in Camden, New Jersey. Gabe, for a variety of different reasons, none greater than his call and responsibility to serve Camden, is unable to be with us today. So fortunately, we have a terrific pinch hitter in Janelle, who's going to be joining us. I really appreciate the pinch hitter reference, since baseball's decided to go on strike and caused me missing my opening day on March 31st. So I can't imagine anybody else better to come into the game and in the bottom of the ninth and knock it in for us. So thank you, Janelle. With us today also are many of our Alternative First Responders Work Group members. You can see their headshots reflected here. For the sake of time, I won't offer commentary on all of them, but I will tell you that they've showed up faithfully every other Tuesday for several months, have engaged diligently, and have been valuable to this process as we've built out this framework. But even more so personally, what I've been able to learn and glean from them have been truly transformative. So thank you to all of you who have been a part of this journey up until this point. The information that both Janelle and I are sharing today are reflective of a collective effort and a collective lift, and not of just the two of us who get a chance to share these things out.
So thank you, Sean. Our work group focused on two key questions. One, what are the successful and promising practices that provide people with the appropriate medical, social service, community resources to complement or supplement traditional police, EMS, and fire first response? And secondly, how can calls to 911 for mental and behavioral health challenges, animal control, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, traffic, noise, burglar alarms, and others be safely offloaded to other non-police responders? So Sean will talk next about the scope of the work directed around these questions.
Thanks, Janelle. Our scope included articulating the vision for what an alternative response could look like, identifying what's working well that should be built on and leveraged, understanding current research on state of practice of alternative response, assessing how alternative first response may reduce or exacerbate structural, implicit, and cultural bias, harm, and inequities, and to craft recommendations to inform the Transform 911 policy blueprint. So really easy, light work. You know, we spent the majority of our time together practicing my really bad dad jokes, because clearly, like, this isn't a heavy lift, and it was really easy to do together. No, just the substance of what we were called to, as you'll see as this thing rolls out and we continue our presentation, was much more cumbersome and complex than I know that I imagined it was, as I got more familiar with the way 911 functions from a community perspective. but furthermore, just the brilliance in the room really helped galvanize some thoughtful work that I'm excited to share with you.
So
Go ahead.
with that, we also wanted our work to be informed by what the research said, right? You want to go?
Actually, Janelle, I think I see, this is where the script thing, I alluded to the script earlier that Rebecca was reading off of, and see, and now we're out, it's like double Dutch, right? It was my turn to still jump in. I let you in, and I just need
go
you,
ahead.
you keep
Go
turning
ahead.
the
I'll
rope.
talk about the research after we talk about.
You got it.
Okay. So some of the things. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, go, because I'm staying on a certain thing, so I don't want to fall off key.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you so much for the slides. Some of the discussion points that one way or another were woven throughout the work included how difficult it is to separate 911 from law enforcement plays a role in the decision to call 911. I know in the communities that I grew up in, that like if you knew police were going to respond, you just wouldn't initiate police because you were afraid of the harm that would be caused by police getting involved in the situation. That we need to go beyond mental health and substance abuse when looking at alternative models. So frequently throughout our nation, there's lots of models being launched and led that address mental health and substance abuse. But what happens when we start talking about domestic violence, right? And what would an alternative response look like for something of that nature? That we need to look at an ecosystem of first and second responders that follow up and care beyond the response. We know that when 911 is initiated and the response happens, but what happens after the response? What happens when we're triaging the trauma that begins to show up after the moment of harm had been caused? That we need person and community-centered approaches, that each one of these calls, although they may be coded as something similar to something else, are different. And how do we make sure that the responses that are happening are consistent with the needs of the individual? And we need flexibility. So each community can create what's best for them, that there isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all solution that will work in any landscape and in any city or any municipality, that we have to be intentional in making sure that this is accessible for all. Back to you, Janelle.
Thanks, Sean. So when we, as a group, and like it's been said, we spent several weeks talking about the discussion points that Sean just mentioned, but we also wanted our work to be informed by what the research actually says. And we can't go into all of that and all of the findings, and we encourage you all to review the research report. It's been published on transform911.org. Again, transform911.org. But at a high level, what we learned from the research that guided our work group's efforts in our weekly or biweekly discussions included the limited options available beyond police, fire, and EMS. And Sean kind of touched on that in one of his first discussion points. Also, that call takers are not typically trained to detect calls related to behavioral health or mental health crisis. So how can we implement some type of training or better be able to suit our dispatchers, our emergency communicators with that? Research also suggests that the share of calls for mental health issues is low, and it requires more interrogation, and better data. Research also indicated CIT training. CIT is Crisis Intervention Team. It's a great training. I'm CIT trained, advanced CIT trained. Many departments, as officers are CIT trained, and though it increases officer knowledge and awareness, there's limited evidence that the outcomes, about the outcomes for the community members. So we needed to look more into that and get more research about that. Mobile crisis units, they also hold promise, but we need to have more research based on those and the effects that they have on the communities and the people that they serve. And then also co-responder models increase access to services and yield savings regarding like public health and the criminal justice system costs. So those are some of the things that we've worked on as far as the training goes.
Thanks,
Sean,
Janelle.
if you want to pick it up with recommendations.
Absolutely. And so we're going to dig into some of our recommendations. Again, I want to emphasize that I think on the forefront of my mind when I began this journey was coming up with recommendations that were like actual items. Here's the response that people should begin to implement. This is what it will look like. This is the path that you take to do it, and less of a process. But as you'll discover as I talk through our key findings, that it made sense for us to refine a process that would lead to the types of responses, because we wanted to make sure that any response that was created was grounded principally in those who are most impacted and traumatized by the system of 911. So first, our recommendations are as follows: to emphasize trauma-informed, culturally sensitive, person-centered responses, to collect data to understand what the response should be, to promote sustainable outcomes, and to create accountability to support desired impact and ensure that system-wide response honors the community. We felt like these four centered recommendations would hold up a possibility that could be sustainable over a prolonged period of time, right? So if we have a response that's trauma-informed, culturally sensitive, and person-centered in its response, then we can understand, have the data to understand, like, that's what this response should be to affirm that this is the way that we're showing up. And the data could also be used to promote sustainable outcomes, which then could be leveraged by creating accountability to support this impact and ensure that there's consistency in the way that it's applied across the board. And we're gonna go even more in depth in some of this as we continue to unpack it over our time together. So in this emphasizing trauma-informed, culturally sensitive, person-centered response, to first is this empowerment of the community to lead and direct response. When we're designing these systems, it's imperative that we're engaging the folks who would be activating 911 or the folks who would be impacted by the activation of 911 to be at the forefront to lead and direct the response. Now, not just community in respect to those who would be activating or have 911 activated as a result of them causing harm, but those who are responsible for showing up on scene, those who are responsible for initiating those calls. What we know to be true is that everybody that's a part of this 911 ecosystem is impacted whenever 911 is engaged. And so it's imperative that all voices are elevated, but also understanding and holding the power dynamics that are at place. And frequently when we're talking about designing these types of systems, those who are most distant from the decision-making are those who are frequently having 911 called on them. And so it's imperative that they're enveloped in the process, not in a manner that, that tokenizes their engagement, but centers them as key stakeholders in leading us to a solution, which is that recognizing the expertise of people with lived experience and centering them as responders. That we believe that not only are the people who have been impacted by 911 central to helping design and build out, but they could also be the responders who show up on scene as an alternative to our typical approach. And then provide secondary response and longer term care after a crisis. What this could look like is, in the work that I do in Seattle, some of it is around responding to gun violence. And we know that young people who have been impacted by gun violence are more likely to pick up a gun and cause harm or be harmed in the future by guns once again. And so we work intentionally with young people who have been impacted by gun violence to reduce the likelihood that they'll be caught up in this cycle of harm by engaging them on a healing journey. That should be accessible and available for anyone who's navigating trauma to make sure that there's secondary response that helps them navigate that trauma and keep them moving forward on their healing journey. Janelle?
Thank you, Sean. So the second recommendation that Sean mentioned was collecting data to understand what the responses should actually look like. So we understand that particular places, as well as particular groups of people, they all have particular needs. So that response is going to look differently depending on where it's at. We want to make sure that we're collecting and analyzing data on a geographical level. So making sure that marginalized groups are given attention in the data. So that's something that we've talked about in making sure that the response resembles the communities and that they serve, and that community members are also involved and have a role in this and serving their community. Also embedding the costs of data analysis in funding structures. So while we recognize that small agencies may not have the resources to collect or analyze data themselves, how do we help them in that process? And acknowledging the limits of quantitative data, and accept that we won't be able to study everything before implementing solutions. So this is all like a work in progress. And then we want to highlight stories and qualitative data to craft compelling narratives and use quantitative data then to support that data. As Sean will talk a little bit more about promoting sustainable outcomes.
Thank you so much, Janelle. And thank you for everybody who's populating the chat box. There's such great and rich dialogue going on right now. And I want you to keep up that energy as we continue this dialogue with each other. And when we talk about promoting sustainable outcomes, what we also know, hey, Brian, could you go on mute for me, please? Brian May Dwell. Thank you. When we talk about promoting sustainable outcomes, some of the things that are centered to this is often we'll get pilot things to launch and roll out and demonstrate some level of effect, but there won't be a way to sustainably resource it to stand it up over a prolonged period of time to actually serve as a consistent alternative response. And so in this creating sustainable funding streams with widespread buy-in is significant, which is identifying potential long-term sources of revenue, such as taxing. We talked a bit about how we can create a national revenue stream around taxes that could be prioritizing these alternative responses. Study and articulating cost benefit analysis, right? Like, how do we make sure that we can not only amplify that this alternative response is having a better impact on those who have historically been harmed by 911, but also financially, it makes more sense because we're spending less resources while we're getting better outcomes. And then build resource pooling or cost sharing structures for smaller communities. You know, not every municipality is going to have a tax base that could help fund innovation. So what are some ways that we can circumvent that if we don't get national resources to do this, but it has to be resourced and funded at a local level? That we need to work towards system change while being realistic about political and logistical factors that will inevitably slow things down. I mean, politics never gets in the way of progress, right? Like, because we always agree and we like have these kumbaya moments, whether you're in city council, whether you're state, local government, whether you're a national government, that's just me in Seattle. Of course not. It's not in Seattle and it's not anywhere, right? So we need to take into consideration that we need to work towards systemic change, because when the system changes, then it's embedded and it's sustainable, and also hold the fact that there's going to be things that will get in the way of working to system change, which is why it's imperative that we're intentionally engaging everyone who's impacted by this, and not just those who may be idealistically aligned with the philosophies that we have or that we're bringing to bear. That we need to consider the other resources that non-police response units will need. You know, if we build up these alternative responses, let's say they live in nonprofit organizations like ours, then there's going to be different resources necessary to stand up that work and make it sustainable over time that you wouldn't necessarily attribute towards funding X amount of law enforcement officers in a community. And evaluate whether responders will be able to get to an emergency fast enough from wherever they are based. And so strategizing around locations, vehicles, and other factors. So if we're going to do this thing and we're going to pilot it in this place and roll something out over a long period of time, like, how do we make sure that it's replicable in different spaces, but able to meet the unique context that may be happening, right? So in the region I live in, and we're Seattle, there's a wealth of resources in Seattle, but south of Seattle, those resources begin to dissipate. And if the majority of the responses that alternatives live like in the city, it may not be practical for them to show up in something south of the city. And how do we make sure that we're positioning those things in an intentional manner? Janelle?
And going along with that, it kind of bridges us into our last recommendation, which is creating community level authority to direct responses. So we've talked about how important it is that we represent the communities and that we have particular groups of people and the particular needs in consideration when we're talking about understanding what an alternative first response would be. So this could be in the form of taking an independent oversight board that has real authority to implement policies, and having everybody on that board that is affected in their community, recognizing that community accountability will mean giving up some power to the community. I'm recognizing that the police and the first responders, aren't the only ones that are able, to provide services and appropriate resources to the community. So giving up some of that power over to the community, building trust and creating channels for the public to react to harm or provide feedback. So certainly allowing the opportunity to talk about what's working and what's not working. Building in availability and responsivenesses of the system so that people who feel impacted by these changes based on the ways people want to be heard. So we want to make sure that we're responsive in the system to make sure that it's impactful and that we're doing what we can to see, the positive outcome. And we want to engage in ongoing transparency and communication to create dialogue around perceived impact outside of the most affected communities. And like we said earlier, this might look different depending on in what area you reside. Now, to better understand that, we want to talk about the future directions and the calls for research. So looking at our recommendations that we talked about, the 4 recommendations, now we're talking about future directions. What trainings would work best to ensure culturally sensitive, trauma-informed responses? So we need to better understand what that might look like, and then taking some of that not just from the police response that's usually automatically deployed. What types of calls are best suited for diversion from traditional 911 responses? So are there calls that not necessarily need an enforcement action? So separating those into levels that may need, a police response may be better suited with a community response. So what that might look like, and what shares of calls does that represent? We want to look at the impact on alternative models on the safe, equitable, and effective resolution in response to the public calls for service. So certainly that's something that's really important. And then what might be unintended consequences of an alternative response model, and how might that be mitigated? So taking into consideration that there might be some consequences that we're not foreseeing in this, but that we'll have to then address at a later time to make sure that they're being responded to. And to what degree do alternative response models, how do we feel they might improve access, efficiency, equity, justice, and safety in our communities? So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the future, and hopefully it'll come up here when we have our discussion in real time. Sean's now going to talk about some of the recommendations, and then a set of questions that we think additional research and future research should focus on.
Yeah, thank you, Janelle. So based on our discussions and recommendations, these are a set of questions that we think are pivotal for future directions and research on alternative response. What context or information would you want a first responder to know before they come to help with an emergency in your neighborhood? What do you think community accountability for 911 should look like? How can we ensure that alternative response agencies have staff, funding, and resources that they need? In an ideal world, who would you want to come help when you call 911 in general or for some particular type of an emergency? And what do you think is missing from the recommendations that is really important to consider when it comes to alternative first responders? Now, I have good news. We are ahead of time in our schedule, which means that there's more time for rich discussion, which is exciting for us as a committee because we were really hoping to leverage the 200 or so of you that are here today to get as much feedback as possible to continue to shape what it is that we're designing for this particular project. So we're going to spend the next 30 minutes or so in a discussion where we want to engage you, get your reactions, your feedback. And we have a couple different discussion questions that we're hoping will guide us. This pauses for that slide to come up, I think. There it is. What context or information would you want a first responder to know before they come to help with an emergency in a neighborhood? And we're going to be using this Mentimeter thing in order to be able to pull your answers. So it's a little bit easier to drop it into this Mentimeter situation. So here's how you use it. I forgot I got to give directions on Mentimeter. Janelle, you should have winked at me or something because I was getting ahead of myself. All right.
I think they're going to put it in the chat. They're going to put the Zoom link in the chat for the.
Did they put the Mentimeter link in there? Got it. Okay. So we get to be like the experimental situation here. There's a link that just dropped into the chat. If you follow that link, it's going to, and then you put in that particular code, it'll prompt you to be able to put in the answers to the questions. To explain Mentimeter, it's a platform as a way to capture your responses. For each question, there'll be a link in the chat. So the first question we're going to lead with is this one here. The link will direct you to this Mentimeter and where you will see a place to put your response. We will all be able to see your responses coming in anonymously, and we'll reflect on what's being shared. The link for the first question is now in the chat. I'm clearly reading the script that I should have read in the first place that I neglected to read, which is where we're finding ourselves right now. Let's get started. If you have any difficulty, tell us in the chat, and the folks who are in the chat will be able to work through that. Thank you so much. So first question, what context or information would you want a first responder to know before they come to help with an emergency in your neighborhood?
And just remember too, that your responses are anonymous.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Janelle. And so some of these come in, whether there's a potential health crisis. Absolutely. To be empathetic and to understand community crisis. That's one of the ones that resonates deeply with me, Janelle, in particular, because I think about how important it is for folks who are responding to understand the context of the community they're showing up in, and to understand that like most of these things aren't happening in isolation. What are some of the ones you're saying that resonate with you?
You know, I really like any known mental health or substance abuse issue or history of issues, because too many times I feel like as a first responder, we're getting there. That's important information to know, because it changes the response, you know, when we're on our way to that type of call for service. So these are great questions. Where are you located? Yeah, that's really important.
Yeah.
Before helping, I mean, and it helps provide a more community-based response as well.
Yeah.
Some background on the issues.
Yeah, it was just that emphasis on the mental health background, if possible. I think about growing up in a household with a father who was schizophrenic and a mother who suffered from dissociative identity disorder, that there was a lot there that when we initiated 911 because of the harm my father was causing, that was complicated by his addiction issues and his mental health issues that were significant when law enforcement were showing up at the house.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If substance use is involved, are there weapons? Yeah, I mean, especially when we're talking about co-responders and what a differential model might look like, that could change if there's weapons. So certainly these are, you know, really great questions. Cultural norms.
Yeah, there's also, I saw further up a minute ago, whether or not a police response is necessary. Like, is there, if there were alternative responses that were available, could you initiate that in your conversation with the person on the other side of the phone to say, you know, we need somebody to show up, but we don't need it to be police, right? We'd like it to be this other option that should be available. What languages are the community members speaking? The cultural considerations that need to be considered. Do we have someone on our team familiar with that neighborhood or community, right? Again, like understanding the context in community where people are responding to is so significant because not every place you show up to is going to be the same. And so the response should be like different, adjusted for that context.
Absolutely. And that's part of what we talk about in our groups, and how we can make that more geared toward the specific communities that are being served. So there's not just a one response fits all.
How to engage me. Yeah. Yes. If people present have anxieties about law enforcement or first responders, right? Like having police show up or first responders show up could be triggering and exacerbate the situation that they were called to respond to in the first place, if that information isn't present.
And many times when there's, you know, mental health issues, that is the case. Autism, different spectrum disorders that a police response can be triggering.
Yeah, and knowing, and I really appreciate this reflection and this truth that knowing if there's a mental health condition or drug or substance abuse, that's the history can be misleading and can elicit bias and discrimination too, right? So how do we make sure that the information that's being provided is being provided in a manner that's not causing an unintended consequence as a result of like knowing more, right? Immigration status should not matter, but knowing what languages are spoken, cultural information, et cetera. Yeah. Know that they have what they need and are equipped to handle the emergency. Our cognitive,
also like too, whether an individual, you know, needs to be transported, really working with community organizations, hospitals, support groups to have that information at hand, you know, and have that information, knowing that before you're helping with an emergency in the neighborhood.
Yeah. I really appreciate this comment. I'd like them to know my preferred outcome: no arrest, detainment, etc. And not just acknowledge that, but like work towards that outcome, right? That if you're calling because something needs to be de-escalated and there's nobody present that can do that, right? Is it possible to get someone to respond to de-escalate without like having the stick held there saying, well, if you don't, right, then we're going to take you, right? Like, what does that look like? Um,
And that's so perfect too, because this actually begins the basis of this conversation. If there's not an arrest to be made and there's no immediate response needed, there's no safety at risk, is the police the right response to go to begin with?
yeah,
So yeah.
yeah. What else do we have here? I'm going to go through a couple more of these, and then I'm going to respond to a few of the questions that have popped up in the chat as well. Or if you are familiar with a responder you prefer to help you. Oh, that's good.
Pull up our document again.
That is really good. To consider, what would it look if, I know that there's folks in the downtown core of Seattle who have familiarity with different responders because they're frequently being called upon. And if there's a way to have someone respond with this familiarity, it could help de-escalate immediately and not have the unintended consequence of turning things up. Yeah, it's really good. Responders have what they need to engage meaningfully and to do work effectively in terms of people and resources, etc. Yes, behaviors a person might show when in distress that can be misinterpreted as threatening by others. You know, like when I'm hearing these things, Janelle, one of the things that I've learned in this process that I wasn't familiar with is just the burden of that's put upon the 911 responder and the call center, and how imperative it is that not only they're resourced as a professional, but that they have the types of support within that setting that allow them to pull this information from people who may be in the midst of trauma and to do it in a way that they can then communicate it and get it out for the folks who are showing up to respond.
I absolutely agree. I agree, Sean.
Yeah, it's such a profound respect for the people who are in the call centers in ways that I never actually understood prior to engaging in this process.
And it goes back to, one of our discussions about making sure that they have the training, in behavioral health and mental health crisis to, are we spending the time in making sure that, and I know that that's talked about a little bit in a different work group, but, they all cross-reference each other, all these work groups, are working toward the same goals. Looking at some of these questions in the discussion, Biz Connors is wondering how to get law enforcement and first responder buy-in to propose changes about how they respond. That's a good question. And I, being a police officer and there's other people with police experiences that work amongst the work groups, I think you'd be surprised that the majority of police officers that support this co-responder differential mode of policing, because we aren't necessarily the best trained to handle all these situations. And like I kind of mentioned when I talked in the beginning, is that our system right now is just like almost automatically set up to send the police to solve everything, even if they're not the best trained. So I think that we have a lot more law enforcement and first responder buy-in than people may actually think about.
Yeah, and I think another part of it too, Jill, is just kind of even this process that we're engaged in, right? Where there's folks from a diversity of disciplines that are working to co-create this way forward. And so it's in this shared labor that we're envisioning what's possible. And it's not just one-sided, where like someone from the community is saying, look, we don't need you to show up. So like, stop, right? It's okay, well, how do we create something together that's an alternative that we can share an investment in that diffuses the need for police to be present and increases the opportunity for community to respond in a meaningful way. But that way we have a shared cadence of how we serve and the roles that we're serving in, and we can build comfort around that. And in doing so, create less pushback. It sounds really easy in the conversation that we're having and in the work group because we spent these many, many months together. But I agree with you. Even the folks who are first responders, in particular in law enforcement that I've talked to, regularly say that there's things that they're showing up to that they don't feel like that they should be showing up to. With the asterisk, I remember many of the conversations we had about the types of things, like when we were talking about domestic violence, right? And what would it look like for an alternative response to domestic violence? when I'm speaking with my law enforcement partners, they're typically not saying, I think community is better to show up to those things, right? So I think there's some things that law enforcement is more likely to easily let go of, and other things that it's going to take a more intentional build to get to a place where there's shared comfort and community being present, and that we've built something with intention and scale that allows safety to show up and be present, and not unintended harm as a result of our zeal.
Yeah, I agree. And of course, there's a difference between, domestic battery and domestics. So domestics, are family issues that need more continued support, need resources, counseling, stuff of that nature. And that's not taken away, obviously, the times that the police need a response when an arrest needs to be made or some type of enforcement action, needs to be done.
Yeah. Mary Norris asked, how can awareness be raised to increase funding for 911 and alternatives? Well, Mary, like number one, when we finish this and just share it out, when you get the email that says like, this is what we went through, share it to as many people as possible. I do think that there's no greater power than the collective us. And the more people that are lifting up the need for alternatives and are being present in these conversations and engaged, the more powerful the request for resources will be. But I think it's in my opinion, it's like a state, city, federal government tiered approach where we have to make sure we're intentionally engaging all of these stakeholders, because there isn't enough money in communities across our country to stand up alternatives today. There just simply isn't. There may be people who are doing work that can be an alternative, but one of the things we talked about at length in our groups together is how we resource these alternative first responders has to be on par with how we've resourced historically our first responders, right? So if we have folks who are expected to show up on scene as outreach workers, but they're making half of what a law enforcement professional might make, then not only do you have folks that aren't sustainable in their role, but we're asking them to do work that's aligned for half the cost, right? And so we have to identify different sources of revenue in order to make sure that we can build sustainable models. Kate adds, how will additional training and technology to integrate other systems with first response and 911 be funded? So another funding question. And there's Kate, there's a technology group that's also going to be presenting that I imagine will speak more specifically to that. Janelle? Yeah,
and that's true. Bonnie writes, what constitutes as an emergency is important to answering these questions, of course. And that's something that we talk about, amongst our work group. We're not saying to get rid of, obviously, police response. There's certainly a need for police officers, first responders, when there's an emergency, when there's a crime in progress, when there's violence. So certainly we're talking about building upon those responses that don't necessarily involve like a police officer or an enforcement level.
Yeah.
These good answers.
And I appreciate Jesse's kind of look at this too, is like great answers, but how much is realistic to provide, or what point are you sharing so much that it gets overwhelming and it's counterproductive? I think like part of the answer to that, Jesse, is like, how is the information being received? And in the way that the information is being received, is it being done in a way that it translates to an actionable response, right? I think a lot about when in direct service, when we're supporting a young person to understand what's going on with them, we're getting a wealth of information over a short period of time and working with them to create a plan. But it's how we're capturing that information and our familiarity with what that information actually means and translates to that can be that can be helpful or can be harmful or counterproductive, as you put it. Janelle?
Yeah, I'm reading. I know that we talked about this preferred outcome. I absolutely agree. And with that preferred outcome and what that answer might look like would depend on what type of group might be responding to that type of call. I know that Liz writes in her experience, it looks different to a community member than a first responder. There are different priorities. Oftentimes we're talking about an overdose, and sometimes that's, they have the responsibility to make sure that that person is safe. So if that person actually is experiencing an overdose and it's something that they can identify as a real overdose, and if they don't, a patient can always 18 and older sign a waiver, to not be transported. So great question. Yeah, the power differential is something that does have to be acknowledged. And these are great points and ideas that we're going to go back in our work groups and shift through and come up with discussions and recommendations as well.
Yeah, Janelle, I want to capture, James Foreman just asked a question in the chat that I want to just call out before we move on to the next Mentimeter question. And I'm curious to know what you see as the greatest obstacle in achieving the dream you've outlined. Is it getting the concept right, getting enough funding, overcoming political obstacles, overcoming bureaucratic obstacles, or something else? James, I think in my opinion, it has a lot to do with getting the right people in the space, building out the actual responses, and making sure that there's resources to put those responses into place in a sustainable way, and that there's data to support those responses when they're put together in a sustainable way to justify the impact that they're having, that then cycles back around to affirming the need for more funding to keep these things lifted up. So in my mind, programmatically, that's what I think about is, how do we get the right people in the space who have been impacted by domestic violence and say, like, we need your help co-creating a model of response that would both allow you to get your needs met if you've been impacted, right? And simultaneously de-escalate the situation, prevent the likelihood of increased harm, right? What does that look like? And bringing law enforcement partners into the space, what does this look like? Bringing EMS in, what does this look like? And bringing the folks in the call center into the space, what does it look like? And in this co-creation model, standing up these alternatives that make sense for the areas where they would be applied, that could generally be applied potentially in other spaces as well. And then funding those things in a way that's not patchwork, where we're not saying, well, here's a year for you to do this thing and see if it works. Here's 18 months, right? A long enough of a runway to prove out impact, and a data collection modality that's embedded in it that allows to prove the impact or make adjustments as necessary, and to affirm the need for future funding as the cycle just continues to pour through. So in my mind, James, that's kind of what I picture as what would it take for this dream to like manifest itself in reality, is that type of synergy between folks with lived experience or connected to the trauma response or the 911 response that creates the traumatic moment so often, whether they're first responders or people who are being called upon or people who have been harmed, co-creating alternatives together through this filter that we've created, and making sure that there's people present that can measure the impact, funding initially to get it going, and then a commitment to continue to fund as the impact manifests itself. The next question in the Mentimeter is, Janelle, do you have that there?
I do. So this is going to work the same way as the last one. How do you think we can ensure that alternative response agencies have staff, funding, and resources they need? So some of this we kind of talked about in the first one, but feel free to put your responses in there and we'll have a discussion and get your ideas. And I think to go to what Sean just said is it's having these conversations and engaging our community members, it's engaging our first responders, it's presenting solutions not only to these problems, but having solutions to back it up. And that's how we get this is from convenings like this. So again, if you don't have it up, how do you think we can ensure that alternative response agencies have the staff, funding, and resources they need?
Yeah. I want to call out, I'm over here leaning into the chat box because there's so many rich things happening in there.
There is.
And I'm like, I want to talk about all of these things. Yeah, like John had that comment that said, flag important point. How do we separate danger or violence calls that may not require law enforcement? We don't want inherent bias to mean that communities of color end up receiving law enforcement response disproportionately because they're called in or coded as violent. Yeah, I mean, like, this is one of the things we talked about in the group was, what would it look like to have 911, like the people who are calling in, actually connecting with people who are from those communities that then have a context for that community to be able to help decipher what is actually happening here, because there's familiarity with the people who are initiating the call in the first place, right? These are some of the things that we dreamt out loud because it's very much the truth. So on to the next question. Janelle, you go ahead and lead the way.
So we got some good responses already. Ensuring that federal, state, and city budgets reflect priorities. We've talked about, these different things in our work group sessions. So it's nice to see that your ideas, align with some of the stuff that we've talked about in our work groups. Two important things is having evidence on savings and effectiveness that senior level politicians and stakeholders buy into. Let me see if I can bring this down a little bit. And helping communities understand the potential so that they magnify the political advantages for elected officials. Very true. It's definitely about buy-in and having people understand, you know, our vision, you know, our North Star, kind of like Rebecca said in the beginning of this, utilizing grant funding to support grassroots efforts up front. We've talked about that too. And those that have experience, I know Sean works as a not-for-profit, but yeah, really utilizing those grant funding. There's tons of support out there. It's just, you know, identifying them and getting the funding for it. Grants, I see grants again.
Yeah, there was also a note about reallocating funds from traditional public safety practices to the alternative responses. I know, like, I live in a city south of Seattle, and our largest budget item is public safety. And what that looks like is really determined by the city council. And if we were standing up alternatives that would lessen the burden on, let's say, police response, for example, then those dollars could be allocated towards these other responses and to be able to stand them up sustainably instead.
Yeah, I mean, even in our groups, we've talked about, you know, as far as staffing with law enforcement across the nation and with retirements and stuff, and filling some of those positions with maybe some of these non-sworn positions, you know, and making them, allocating the funding, you know, toward the community groups and community response, you know, that rather than traditional law enforcement or police services, especially when we can identify some of the responses that we talked about earlier, the burglar alarms and, you know, noise complaints that might not necessarily require a police response. And that's really the majority of calls that police officers respond to. You know, the violent in progress calls are actually a smaller amount, even in Chicago.
Yeah, recognizing 911 professionals as first responders and raising the pay to attract talent. Absolutely. I can't emphasize that point enough, Janelle. Like, if you pay people as professionals, right, they show up and serve as professionals. I know our organization recently raised our base wages for all of our team members up to 70 grand a year to be able to meet the cost of living which is ridiculous in the Seattle area, right? So our direct service folks all make 70 because they're professionals and they need to be treated and resourced as professionals, and we're going to continue to expect them to show up that way. And 911 call center professionals are exactly that. And if we're going to ask them to gather the information necessary to create to make sure the right response is being issued, then we have to make sure we're resourcing them in a manner that prioritizes their experience.
And even identifying them as such. I mean, they are first responders. Yeah. And they should be considered across the board as that.
Yeah,
and with that, it would change, you know, their pay and benefit package and make it more desirable for somebody to want to do to begin with.
Yeah, but you know, prior to this experience, I didn't think of them as any different. Like, I didn't think call center I think it was just all one thing of first response to me prior to understanding some of the semantic nuances of how everybody involved here talks about it. Mobilize and empower communities to understand how they can make policy changes happen that support what they want to see in public safety. Absolutely. That goes back to the power of the collective us, right? Like, if you stand up as a constituency and say, this is what we want to see and how we want to see it, and you hold that line. I mean, we in our region, we saw this work for a moment and then begin to fail shortly after, because there's a need for sustained pressure to be applied to not only hold folks accountable to making commitments to invest in things differently, but like honoring those commitments after the words have been spoken. Offering relevant supervision and co-reflection for community responders, sometimes peer supervision and peer support. Yep.
I like this one too. Prove that alternative response agencies can help reduce gun violence, an initiative that is being funded by the federal government. You know, because we do got to tap into things that we already know are working and that the government's already providing funding for.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, these are really, really excellent responses.
Are receiving. Go on. I'm sorry, Janelle.
And I was just going to say, it certainly helps us when we go back, you know, and use these ideas as we move forward.
Yeah. Designate current staff from agencies to be a part of the alternative response team. Like, I like that idea a lot. And with I have a bias, and I can't help it. It won't escape me because it's just part of my humanity, right? Like, so I put an asterisk next to that. as long as the folks that are part of the alternative response team aren't so indoctrinated in a culture that prevents them from seeing people in community as community members. I know that one of the things I do I sit on this committee where we watch use of force videos with our local law enforcement agency. And regularly, when they talk about the person involved, they don't talk about them as a community member. They talk about them in relation to the thing that they're doing. And they're just as much community members as anyone else is. They're just community members who are having a moment of poor decision making that may be causing harm, right? And so like making sure that the people who are involved in these processes are centering the humanity of folks as community members and not as like criminals.
Yeah, that goes with our person-centered response.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And one that I just seen that was really good too. I don't know if I'd go back.
Support alternative responders and first responders, mental health. Yes, yes. High stress leads to burnout and staffing shortages, and the lower the pay, the shorter their tenure. All right, like I can only imagine what it's like in a call center space. I mean, I can only imagine because I've never worked in that space or served in that manner, but the type of turnover that has to be present because of the constant like being inundated with secondary trauma, and whether or not there's intentional supports built in to support the people who are serving in that way beyond the compensation, but just like, what are you doing to make sure there's balance there so folks don't burn out and leave?
Use peers on crisis response teams. Absolutely. We've talked about people with lived experience definitely becoming involved in these responses and having a role. But yeah, again, paying them accordingly and not sending it on educational requirements and basis requirements, but training that then can be provided and that's accessible to everybody.
Yeah, yeah. This is one that's near and dear to my heart down here. Not asking organizations to prove they are effective when police departments are constantly funded without having to prove anything. Like absolutely. Like, how can we? I'd also say, how do we make sure that people are being held to the same standard of measurements of efficacy, right? So if like as a community-based organization, I have to prove impact year over year to maintain funding, and if the impact doesn't show up as it has historically, then the funding can go away. But that same burden of or same standard of efficacy isn't necessarily held in every sector of public safety, even though we see ourselves as a core component of a public safety response, right? You picking up what I'm putting down?
Yep.
Yeah. Can we scroll down just a little bit? I wanted to see some of the other ones that just popped up down there.
I mean, and there are like, accreditation processes for police departments, but it certainly isn't a requirement. Not every agency has to be accredited. And maybe that's a whole nother conversation that needs to be had.
Yeah. Share aggregated data with the public in a near real-time basis so advocacy orgs and others can contribute to policy, budgeting, and priorities on a more informed basis. I'll tell you something I discovered in this process that was really like challenging for me was that there isn't consistency in data collection across 911 nationally, and that things aren't coded the same everywhere, that data is not gathered the same everywhere. And so it's hard to create like a national landscape snapshot simply through data that reflects what is and what isn't happening and how like disproportionality is being perpetuated, for example, right? Because it's so unique to the community that's leveraging the particular response. And so we've talked a lot about work around that. Like, how do you look at data points that are different everywhere, but find shared narratives that tell a story that allow us to respond accordingly, right? To be able to advocate and contribute in ways to make the budgeting and policy priorities change in our community.
Yeah, I'm reading this one and it just makes me think, change state and municipal legislation to mandate 911 funds be made available to alternative response agencies. There's actual Reform Act, Police Reform Act last year that mandates different criteria for departments. And it was like a 5-year plan. And by 2023, government agencies have to have a differential response for mental health related issues. But like for us at the university, we're not a government agency. So there needs to be something that's for all, law enforcement agencies, because we've got private sectors, we got different special police departments that might not necessarily be mandated to do these things.
Yeah, I'm over here looking both at the chat and at the screen. This is like, What are some other things that you're seeing over there, Janelle, that are popping for you?
Um, establishing a rating agency certification process. And like I said too, there's some agencies have it, some don't, but maybe making that more across the board. I do agree.
Let's do this. Let's move to our last question because we only have 10 minutes left, and Natalie's doing such a great job reminding me, so we can keep moving through. I just got excited, Natalie. I'm sorry. Forgive me. What do you think is missing from these recommendations? It's really important to us when it comes to, or that is really important to consider when it comes to alternative first responders, which is really important to us as the work group that's been putting this together. So please, hop into this next Mentimeter link that is going to be populated for you to click on, put in the code, and do the same thing that we've been doing for the other two.
Get our other document up here.
Yeah. Or until the Mentimeter populates, feel free to drop it into the chat if it hasn't shown up yet. There we go. Thanks, Rebecca. This is like the awkward silence period of time, where we wait for more information. And I could fill it with dad jokes, but I don't think that's necessary.
I think people are really thinking about what to write, which is great.
Yeah. I really appreciate Tina's reflection, how we keep alternative first responders safe when a situation escalates, whose responsibility is that? Tina, I led for a period of time gang and group violence intervention efforts in our community, and we would show up and work to de-escalate tensions in high-risk situations in partnership with law enforcement. And I think that cadence was pretty successful and impactful. And we were really well trained to be able to de-escalate those situations and also understand when things would get to a point that we would need to back out and let other supports show up that would better suit what was manifesting at that particular time. So I think a lot of it goes into training. Yeah. We shouldn't stick to police, fire, or mental health responders only. For instance, imagine 911 is called, the dispatcher has a number of personal contact who should be called whenever police or crisis responders respond. Yeah. I'm curious about that, and I want to know more, and we only have a handful of minutes. So whoever put that, if you want to add I hear that and I'm like, what does that look like? Is the question that I have, because that idea really inspires me.
This one too, for calls like mental health crisis, how do we intervene before someone reaches the point of a crisis? Early intervention can and should be, a first response. And that kind of goes with some of the questions that we talked about on our first discussion about getting that information off the bat, but then also, having more community outreach and engagement and, education on intervention and in signs of intervention and providing that to community members.
That everyone who touches a victim in an emergency 911 situation is kind, caring, and interested. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and we need to expand who is the victim, because I think anybody who leaves a situation harmed is a victim, even if they were the one accused of causing harm in the first place.
I like this too. We've talked about this in our biweekly meetings, create talent pipelines for youth and community college students to become telecommunicators for 911, 918, or 988 and alternative crisis response. Yeah, I mean, even just proper recruiting, community events and even through commercials and having those programs available.
It's also the wage conversation again, Janelle.
Yes,
like if you're recruiting people into living wage jobs, then it's much more compelling. When we did our wage change, we had young people talk to our team members and say, man, I could actually see myself doing your job now. Like, that's the kind of pipeline that you want to create, but it has to be incentivized by letting them see, no, you can actually, take care of yourself and do work that matters. And is deeply meaningful in that way.
This is an interesting response. Training all responders to be prepared for the presence of firearms. Because anybody, right, could have a firearm,
Yeah.
but really trying to eliminate potential of risk, right, or the potential of harm. And that goes back to asking the right questions, about a person's history and understanding their environment and the community that they live in. So yeah, these are all important things that we need to consider.
Yeah, I want to, and I know that it's in the chat, but I want to call out Shannon's contribution that there's a group of families in DC that don't use emergency first response for their children's crisis. They have a phone tree where they call another family during a crisis, and they have all been trained in de-escalation. It allows family members to take the back seat in trying to address the crisis and provides a non-system response. Shannon, I think like that may have been, I love that, right? First of all, I love that. And I think that might have been in response to my question for telling me what that looks like. And so thank you so much for following up. Like, yes, I absolutely can see that and appreciate that approach. That authentic community response that's embedded within the community that's initiating the response. Let's see what else. Adding to the we shouldn't, the point is by contacting.
I was just reading that one too.
Oh, what's that? Oh, you were just reading
that
one
it's
too?
Funny you're reading that one because that's the one that I just was looking at that one too.
Yeah, that the point is by contacting a neighbor or loved one who might co-respond, it could help de-escalate the situation more quickly and effectively. Yeah. There needs to be more ongoing communication at a high system level between typical responders and alternative responders to ensure success. Yeah, I think there's a lot of either or and not a ton of synergy, and that's super helpful. To do that, like, I think that there's some healing work that needs to be done, because sometimes being in those spaces as an alternative responder could be pretty traumatizing because of lived experiences that you've had that have led you into the space of wanting to be an alternative responder. But definitely. Yeah. What else is popping for you, Janelle?
And definitely it's going kind of quick, but there was just something about having conversations between first responders and then community first responders. Definitely. They were not necessarily that we envision them working separately, but together, combined or supplementing some areas where the first responders, but there would definitely be, a strong working relationship. There would have to be, just because situations can change. They become very fluid, at any moment. Yeah.
I just want to call out a couple of things that have been pulled from the chat box. That Martine notes that really wants to emphasize the points on the last question about funding and data, that collecting data and crunching numbers is a different skill set from carrying out actions that build deep and sustainable community. Absolutely. Like when I was kind of sharing like that vision, when to James's question, like that's absolutely what I see. You need the people who are like collecting the data, measuring the data to affirm the work that's happening on the ground, to justify sustainable funding and to prove out the impact that it's having. And Cosette also noted earlier that there's a lot of assumptions that folks have the staff capacity to respond to grants or apply for Medicaid funding. The application process itself is prohibitive. So when we're talking about sustainable funding and capacity building, that many of the organizations who would be most adept at being alternative responders won't necessarily have the capacity within the organizations to do the administrative stuff to bring the funding forward. And so taking that in consideration as we're dreaming about what's possible. Absolutely, I really appreciate that. What else do we have here? A third-party opt-in database where people with known mental health issues with the likeliness to call or support could either enter a phone tree or support. Yeah, I could see that working. I really appreciate the acknowledgement, the innovation there, and the acknowledgement of some of the potential risk, but the possibility that's there as well. Yeah. Probably got another minute or so. Anything else really resonate for you?
Yeah, trying to see if I can go back. Like this one too, acknowledging the continued institutional trauma that many community members continue to experience, not only from the police, but also many social services that engage with detainment and coercion. Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things that make us have that inspire these conversations and the creation of this work group, is really trying to change that narrative and to just stray away from arrests and making arrests in situations that don't necessarily, that's not what the response should look like. Yeah. Janelle, I mean, as we wrap our time up, I want to
first and foremost say thank you to the now 173 of y'all. We started out with 200 and something. It must have been my dad jokes that got people to drop off. But like, shout out to all of you who tapped in and joined us for this part of today's sharing. Janelle, thanks for coming in the pinch and really like leaning in and co-facilitating with me. Not only the positionality of the way that you serve our community is impactful, but the lived experience that you bring into the space with your own personal story and how you've been impacted by 911 adds another layer of texture that really helps this work come alive. So I'm honored by you and grateful for you and so terrifically inspired to have you on this journey.
I'm honored to be here, Sean. Thank you so much. That means a lot. And like you said, with the 172 people that we have, not only that you're here, but that you're engaging and that you're participating. And this is also helpful because over the course of the next few months, we're going to continue to make sense of all this feedback, and we're going to work together to generate, additional transformative recommendations based on all of this stuff that we're coming up with here today.
Yeah. So please stay connected, stay tapped in, stay engaged. This is just a moment, not the culminating moment that's going to lead us to creating the world that we imagine can exist, where 911 can be accessed and people can get a response that truly meets the need, and not just a response, not only a response that's rooted in our historical way of being. With that, go ahead, Janelle.
Okay. I was just going to say with that, over the next few minutes, we're going to hear from another 911 professional who will discuss the importance of this work and then close out today's session. So we do, again, thank all of you for joining and participating so much in this conversation. It means so much to myself, to Sean, and to everyone who's worked on this work group.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
I see you back on camera.
Thank you so much, Sean and Janelle, and please, everyone participating, join me in thanking Janelle and Sean for leading us in this really important conversation. These recommendations will be available online, as we mentioned before, and the research is available online as well. Janelle mentioned that we'll be listening and hearing from another 911 professional who will discuss the importance of this work in another few minutes, and then we are going to hear from Laura Euland and George Rice to share out the recommendations from the 911 Professional Career and Supports Work Group. Thank you all so much, and we look forward to seeing you after we hear from Rita Salazar. Thank you.
My name is Rita Salazar. I work at Valley Communications in South King County of Washington State. I've been a call receiver for 21 years, almost 22 in April. The current state of the telecommunicator field in our community isn't real good. We're really short-staffed, we're overworked, we're burnt out, and there is more stress and trauma than I've ever seen in my 21 years. We have lost probably 30% of our workforce in the last 2 years. We're at the lowest staffing we've been at in over 2 decades. We're kind of in dire straits, just like I think the 911 centers nationwide are, and we can't find the people to fill the seats anymore. People don't want to do this job. They don't want to work on the weekends and holidays, and the way that people talk to us now is very different than when I first used to start. Everybody in this profession, I'm a helper. When I have someone that is terrified or scared or very ill, and I can actually help them, and by the time I'm off that call at the end, they thank me, and I have helped relieve some of that stress or some of that trauma by talking them through it. That's why I do this job. I've been here for 21 years and I love my job. When I was hired 21 years ago, there was over 600 applicants in my class of 6. Now it's a struggle to even get 20 applicants. I'm hoping that we can somehow bring these people back to do this job for the community.